Welcome to Sleepcast, probably the most boring podcast in the world. Our goal, as always, is to provide you with a gentle, soothing auditory landscape. Just a quiet place to rest your weary mind and, let the tension melt away.
Right, just unwind.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So today we are taking a very calm, unhurried stroll through a bit of sporting history. We're going to be opening up a series of archival documents, regulatory frameworks, and government white papers concerning English football.
Very dry. Very relaxing stuff.
Extremely dry. But I have to let you in on a little secret about the deep dive we've prepared for you today. You might think a regulatory review of football governance sounds like, a cure for insomnia.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like it on the surface.
Right. But the documents we're actually unpacking, they read less like an accountant's ledger and much more like a mafia thriller.
Oh, absolutely.
Beneath the bureaucratic language, this is a story packed with intense, blood-pumping drama, billion-dollar betrayals, historic miracles, and literally a fight for the soul of a global institution.
It's a staggering juxtaposition, really. I mean, if you just read the index of the fan-led review of football governance, you see terms like liquidity ratios, shadow boards, corporate structures.
Yeah, real page-turners.
Right, exactly. But if you actually understand the mechanisms at play, you realize you're looking at the autopsy of a cultural phenomenon. It's this incredible story of raw human emotion, tribal loyalty being commodified, and just staggering amounts of unregulated capital completely destabilizing a sport that took, over a century to build.
So here is our mission for this deep dive.
Yeah.
We're going to unpack these historical archives, the season reviews, and this rather hefty government document.
Yeah.
But we aren't just going to list off who won what or what dates things happened.
No, that would defeat the purpose.
Exactly. We want to answer a fundamental driving question for you.
Yeah.
How exactly did a simple game invented to build character in Victorian schoolboys transform into an unregulated playground for global billionaires?
Which is a massive leap.
It is. And perhaps more importantly, by looking at the proposed regulations, can we determine if the fans of this beautiful game actually have the leverage to take their power back?
That's the real crux of it.
So let's start by looking at the foundation. The year is 1863. We are in London, specifically at the Freemasons Tavern in Great Queen Street. It's an October evening, and a London solicitor named Ebenezer Morley has called a meeting.
Yeah, and Morley is really the perfect lens through which to view the origins of the modern game, because his primary motivation was, it was sheer frustration with structural chaos.
He just wanted some order.
Right. He had formed Barnes FC the year prior in 1862. And at this point in Victorian England, football was not a unified entity at all. It was an incredibly fragmented, localized activity.
Like every town playing a different game.
Almost, yeah. You had old boys from various elite public schools, Eton, Harrow, Rugby, Charterhouse, and they're moving to London for their professional careers. And obviously they wanted to continue playing the games of their youth. But every single school had developed its own distinct set of rules based on the geography of their specific school grounds.
Wait, I want to pause on that for a second. If these were highly educated public school boys, future leaders of the empire and all that, why was the landscape so chaotic?
That's a fair question.
Didn't they have the administrative capacity to just write down a unified code long before 1863?
Well, they had the capacity, sure, but they lacked the necessity. Because until the mid-19th century, these schools were relatively isolated ecosystems.
Oh, I see.
The transport infrastructure, primarily the railway network, just hadn't developed to a point where inter-school matches were a regular occurrence. You mostly played within your own house or against other houses in the same school.
So you didn't need to agree with anyone else.
Exactly. But once these young men congregated in London and attempted to form adult clubs, the incompatibility became a complete crisis. You'd arrange a match between two clubs, show up on a freezing Saturday afternoon, and basically spend the first hour arguing over whether you were allowed to catch the ball.
Just standing in a muddy field yelling at each other.
Pretty much. Or they'd argue over whether, kicking an opponent in the shins was a legitimate defensive tactic.
It sounds like trying to play a board game where every single player at the table is reading from a different instruction manual. And half the table thinks physical violence is just a standard part of the game.
That is a highly accurate comparison.
So Morley writes a letter to a popular sporting newspaper of the time, Bell's Life, and essentially says, we need a definite code of rules. That public call to action leads directly to this meeting at the Freemasons Tavern.
Right.
And the archives list the 12 original clubs that showed up. The names are fantastic, by the way. You have Barnes, obviously, but also Crusaders, Forest of Leytonstone, and a team literally called the No Names from Kilburn.
The no names. It's brilliant. And it is worth noting the socioeconomic makeup of that room, too. These were gentlemen, professionals, men of leisure.
The Victorian elite.
Exactly. And out of all those original clubs, the records show only one sole survivor operating today, which is the Civil Service FC, though they were listed at that 1863 meeting under the rather imposing title of the War Office.
Wow. The War Office.
Yeah, and they still play amateur football today. But the process of getting those 12 clubs to actually agree on a unified set of rules was not, a simple evening of polite agreement.
I can imagine.
It took 6 incredibly contentious meetings stretched out over 44 days to birth the Football Association, or the FA.
Yeah, I was looking through the minutes of those early debates, and the sticking point wasn't about the size of the pitch or the duration of the match. The most feverish dispute was over a practice called hacking.
Ah, yes. Hacking.
And hacking, for those uninitiated, it was exactly what it sounds like. It was intentionally kicking your opponent in the leg to bring them down.
And this is where we see the ideological soul of the early game being contested. A club called Blackheath FC adamantly, fiercely wanted to keep hacking in the rules.
They loved it.
They did. Their representative, Francis Mall Campbell, argued that banning hacking would destroy the courage and pluck of the game. He famously declared that without hacking, you would bring over a lot of Frenchmen who would beat you with a week's practice.
Which is just an incredibly loaded, very Victorian way of arguing about masculinity, right?
It tells us everything about what they thought the sport was actually for. For Blackheath, the pain, the physical endurance, the literal bruising, that was the entire point.
It was a feature, not a bug.
Exactly. It was a crucible for building character, specifically a rugged, imperial kind of British masculinity. If you took away the physical danger, you were watering down the moral utility of the sport.
Right.
But morally, approaching this with a solicitor's mind, recognized that if adults were going to play this game regularly without suffering career-ending injuries every weekend, a line had to be drawn between a contact sport and outright assault.
Which seems reasonable. And Morley's drafted laws ultimately won out. Hacking was banned. Handling the ball, which was more aligned with the rugby school tradition, was largely phased out of this specific code.
And Blackheath actually withdrew from the FA in protest over the hacking ban?
They took their ball and went home. But the remaining clubs published their unified rules in a little booklet that cost £1 6 and the game, as we begin to recognize it structurally, it took shape.
It did, but having a rule book is only half the battle.
Sure.
A code of laws doesn't create a culture. You need a mechanism to incentivize people to actually play against each other under these specific rules, rather than just retreating back to their local informal variations.
Which brings us to 1871, and a man named Charles Alcock. He's the FA secretary at the time, and he pitches an idea that fundamentally alters the trajectory of the sport.
This is a huge moment.
He proposes a sudden death knockout tournament, open to all member clubs. He bases the idea on the inter-house competitions from his school days at Harrow. This is the birth of the FA Cup.
The oldest national football competition in the world.
Exactly. But when I read the source material on this, the reaction from the clubs was just baffling. Out of the 50 member clubs in the FA at that time, only 12 agreed to participate in the inaugural tournament.
Yeah, it was a tough sell.
The documentation specifically notes that clubs were terrified that a knockout competition would lead to, quote, unhealthy rivalry and even bitterness.
It is a remarkable piece of historical irony. I mean, the founders of a sport that is now defined by its intense, tribal, almost fanatical rivalries were originally terrified that people might actually care too much about winning.
I have to throw this to you because it seems like a complete psychological disconnect. If the founders were so deeply worried about unhealthy rivalry in 1871, how did we arrive at the hyper-competitive, deeply tribal nature of the sport just a couple of decades later? What was the mechanism that shifted the culture from polite recreation to desperate competition?
The mechanism was the collision of the sport with the Industrial Revolution.
Okay, how so?
What we have to understand is the geographical and cultural divide that quickly emerged as the game spread. In the south of England, football remained heavily rooted in that public school ethos of amateurism we just talked about.
Right. Gentlemen playing for fun.
The ideology was strict. You played for the love of the game, for physical fitness, and for gentlemanly camaraderie. The idea of paying someone to play or playing purely to entertain paying spectators was seen as vulgar. It was viewed as a corruption of the sport's pure moral ideals.
Because if you are a gentleman of leisure, you don't need to be compensated for your recreation. You have independent wealth.
Exactly, and this is the crucial economic point. As the games spread up to the industrial north and the Midlands, places like Lancashire and Yorkshire, it was adopted by working-class communities.
Mill workers, miners, that sort of thing.
Factory hands, yeah. For these men, playing football on a Saturday afternoon meant taking time off work. And in a piece rate or hourly industrial economy, taking time off work meant losing crucial wages.
They literally couldn't afford to play.
It was a luxury they simply could not afford. So the northern clubs, who were fiercely competitive and desperately wanted to win the newly minted FA Cup, realized that to secure the best players and to allow those players time to train and travel, they had to compensate them for their lost wages.
Makes sense?
This was initially called broken time payments.
So the Southern elite viewed amateurism as a moral high ground, but structurally, it functioned as a massive barrier to entry. It was essentially a luxury tax that only the wealthy could afford to pay.
That is the perfect way to contextualize it. The northern clubs weren't just trying to cheat the system. They were treating football as an emerging business in an industrial economy.
They saw the potential.
They saw that thousands of working-class people were willing to pay a few pennies to stand on a bank and watch their local team play. If you have paying spectators, you have a revenue stream.
Right.
And if you have a revenue stream, you can afford to pay your workers, the players. It's just basic capitalism applying itself to a leisure activity.
And the FA, situated down in London and dominated by Southern amateurs, they tried to fight this tooth and nail. They wanted to ban any club that paid its players.
They were appalled by it.
But the momentum of the Northern industrial clubs was just too powerful.
Yeah.
They had the crowds, they had the talent, and they started dominating the FA Cup. The pressure became insurmountable.
It really did.
So the FA realized that if they didn't bend, the Northern clubs would just break away and form their own association. So in 1885, the FA officially legalized professionalism.
And the moment you legalize professionalism, the entire economic foundation of the sport changes forever.
Because now it's a job.
Because once you're paying players a regular wage, you have fixed costs. And a knockout tournament like the FA Cup is inherently unpredictable. If you get knocked out in the first round in November, you suddenly have no guaranteed fixtures for the rest of the season, but you still have to pay your players every week.
Which is a terrifying business model.
It's totally unsustainable.
Enter William McGregor in 1888. He's a committee man for Aston Villa, a massive club in Birmingham. He looks at this landscape and realizes that a business cannot survive on random cup draws. You need a reliable, predictable product to sell to your consumers.
McGregor understands supply and demand. He realizes that to run a sustainable professional football club, you need regular, guaranteed, high-quality fixtures that you can advertise in advance to generate guaranteed gate receipts.
So you always know money's coming in.
Right. So he writes to a select group of top clubs and proposes a closed system, a league where every team plays every other team home and away over the course of a season.
And so the Football League is created with 12 clubs.
Exactly. This is the moment football transitions from a chaotic recreational pastime into a structured commercial entertainment industry.
It is genuinely incredible how rapidly that escalated. We went from a bunch of solicitors arguing over whether you can kick a guy in the shins in a tavern to a fully professionalized, structured, revenue-generating league in just 25 years.
It was a very fast, very aggressive evolution.
And that league structure, essentially created by McGregor to guarantee gate receipts, held remarkably steady for an entire century. But to truly understand the multi-billion-pound juggernaut we see today, we can't just look at the foundation.
No, we have to look at when the cracks started showing.
Right. We have to jump forward to the moment the structure almost completely collapsed. We have to look at the darkest period in English football history. We are moving from the Victorian era to the mid-1980s.
Yeah, and it is difficult to accurately convey to a modern audience just how profoundly bleak the landscape was in the mid-1980s. When we read through the historical reviews of this era, the data paints a picture of an industry in terminal decline.
The numbers are staggering. Going into the 1985-86 season, English football had absolutely no television deal in place.
None.
The broadcasters and the league had completely failed to reach an agreement. So for months, there was virtually no football on television. Attendances across the country had plummeted to all-time historic lows.
People were just staying away.
And the cultural perception of the sport was entirely toxic. It was associated heavily with hooliganism, violence, and urban decay.
And the infrastructure was quite literally crumbling. The stadiums were essentially Victorian relics. They were unsafe, terraced bowls made of wood and corrugated iron, severely lacking in any modern investment or safety protocols.
Which led to awful consequences.
Tragically, yes.
Yeah.
This chronic underinvestment culminated in horrific disasters. You had the Heysel Stadium disaster in Belgium involving English fans, which led to all English clubs being banned from European competition for 5 years.
Wow. 5 years.
And you had the devastating Bradford City Stadium fire, where 56 people lost their lives simply because a wooden stand caught fire. The sport was not just failing economically, it was failing in its basic duty to keep human beings safe.
And then following another catastrophic tragedy at Hillsborough in 1989, the government commissioned the Taylor Report. And this report mandated that all top-flight stadiums had to become all-seater venues.
Right.
The standing terraces had to be demolished and replaced with seats. This was a massive mandated infrastructure cost thrust upon the clubs at a time when they were already economically depressed.
Which creates an existential economic crisis for the top tier of clubs. You have the biggest clubs in the country, the likes of Manchester United, Liverpool, Arsenal, Tottenham, Everton, looking at their balance sheets.
And panicking, I assume.
Definitely. Under the old football league structure, television revenues and sponsorship money were shared quite equitably down through all 4 divisions of the professional pyramid. It was a mutual model.
Right, solidarity.
But the top clubs looked at this and realized the math simply didn't work for them anymore. They felt they were generating the vast majority of the public interest and television value, yet they were subsidizing dozens of smaller clubs.
While their own stadiums required millions in mandated upgrades.
And their competitive edge in Europe was vanishing due to the ban.
So they realized they were carrying the financial weight of the entire pyramid. They needed a massive, unprecedented injection of cash, and the only logical mechanism to achieve that was to break the mutual model and retain a much larger slice of the broadcasting pie for themselves.
Exactly.
The solidarity that had held the league together since 1888 was fracturing under economic pressure.
Which leads to a quiet but incredibly aggressive corporate maneuver. On July 17, 1991, the top clubs signed a document known as the Founder Members Agreement.
And this laid the legal groundwork for a breakaway.
It did. And then, on February 20th, 1992, they executed the plan. In a move that fundamentally shook the sporting world, 22 First Division clubs resigned from the Football League en masse.
Just walked away.
They walked away from a 104-year-old institution to form the Premier League.
And crucially, the Premier League was established as a private, limited company.
Yeah.
It had complete commercial independence from the Football League.
This is the critical pivot point in modern sports economics. By breaking away, these 22 clubs were now entirely free to negotiate and organize their own broadcast and sponsorship agreements.
Without having to consult or share with the 70-odd clubs they left behind in the lower divisions?
Precisely. And they made a radically bold, highly controversial choice with their media rights. Instead of sticking with the traditional free-to-air terrestrial broadcasters like ITV, they struck an exclusive live television deal with a relatively new, highly aggressive paid TV company called B-Ski-B.
Owned by Rupert Murdoch.
Yes.
I want to dig into the mechanics of this television deal because the numbers in the archive are shocking for that era. It was a £191 million deal over 5 years.
Astronomical at the time.
But it wasn't just the amount of money, it was the mechanism of delivery. The concept of charging fans a monthly subscription fee, forcing them to buy a satellite dish just to watch live domestic football games, was entirely alien in the UK.
People were outraged.
It was culturally offensive to many.
It was viewed by many traditionalists as a betrayal of the working-class roots we discussed earlier. The sport that had been sustained by local communities was suddenly being hidden behind a paywall.
When I look at this 1992 breakaway, it feels remarkably similar to an indie band that has built a massive, loyal grassroots following over decades, suddenly ditching their independent label to sign a massive cutthroat corporate record deal.
That's a good way to look at it.
It deeply upsets the purists. They get called sellouts. But overnight, the marketing and distribution power of that corporation turns them into global superstars. The infusion of that Sky television money instantly changed the landscape.
The analogy is sound, but we need to look at exactly how that Sky deal functioned, because it was a massive gamble. The Premier League archives include testimony from Richard Scudamore, the incredibly influential former chief executive of the league. He explained the broadcast ecosystem that was built in 1992, and it reveals a highly sophisticated media strategy. Scudamore pointed out that while the massive pay TV deal with Sky was the financial engine of the league, the entire model relied completely on a symbiotic relationship with a terrestrial, free-to-air show, the BBC's Match of the Day.
Okay, this is where I want to push back a bit, or at least challenge the conventional wisdom. Hiding your premium product behind a paywall immediately alienated a huge portion of the fan base who simply couldn't afford a satellite dish in 1992.
True.
From a long-term brand building perspective, how is restricting access to your core demographic a brilliant strategy?
Because they didn't restrict access to the narrative, they only restricted access to the live event. This is the genius of the Scudamore model.
Oh, I see.
If you put all your football, including the highlights, behind a paywall, you do risk losing cultural relevance. You risk losing the next generation of fans who can't afford the subscription. But Match of the Day, which aired on Saturday nights on the free-to-air BBC, acted as a loss leader, or, more accurately, the ultimate top-of-funnel marketing mechanism.
It's the shop window.
Precisely. It gave every single person in the country free access to the storyline of the season. You saw every goal, you saw the controversy, you understood the drama. It was a cultural touchstone.
So a casual viewer watches the highlights on Saturday night, they get completely hooked on the narrative arc of the season, and suddenly they feel a burning desire to see these events unfold in real time.
And that free exposure on the BBC drove the demand for the premium live subscriptions on Sky. The terrestrial highlights created the cultural cachet, and the pay TV model monetized that cachet at a premium rate.
Let's talk about how that influx of capital translated to the product on the pitch during that inaugural 92-93 season, because the transition was immediate.
It was a very different game almost overnight.
The opening weekend is electric. You have Brian Deane scoring the very first Premier League goal with a header just 5 minutes in for Sheffield United. And he ironically scores it against Manchester United.
Setting the stage early.
Then you have Alan Shearer. This is a perfect example of the new economic reality. He had just transferred to newly promoted Blackburn Rovers. Blackburn was backed by a local steel baron, Jack Walker, who utilized his immense personal wealth to break the British transfer record, paying £3.6 million for Shearer.
Which again was a staggering sum.
And Shearer justifies it instantly, scoring 2 spectacular goals on his debut.
Blackburn is a fascinating precursor to what would happen a decade later. Walker essentially utilized private wealth to artificially accelerate a club's growth, bypassing the traditional organic revenue-building process.
Just writing the check.
Exactly. And it worked, eventually winning them the title a few years later. But that specific 900-293 season belonged to Manchester United.
They had lost that opening game to Sheffield United, but they ended up breaking a 26-year wait for top-flight title. And the archives show it was aided by incredibly dramatic, made-for-TV moments.
Which is exactly what Sky wanted.
You have center back Steve Bruce scoring a 97th-minute winner against Sheffield Wednesday, which essentially birthed the mythos of Fergie time. And you have the mid-season arrival of Eric Cantona from Leeds United.
Cantona.
A highly controversial, mercurial Frenchman who brings a level of flair and arrogance that completely transformed their campaign. It was the perfect narrative for Sky to broadcast.
But as we look at this transition, we have to analyze the regulatory failure that allowed it to happen.
Okay, what do you mean?
When the Football Association, the ultimate governing body of the sport in England, sanctioned this breakaway, they essentially allowed the top tier of clubs to form their own commercially independent entity. They allowed them to keep all the television money.
And this is what baffles me when reading the government reports. How does a regulatory body just hand over the commercial rights to its most valuable asset?
It seems crazy now.
Did the FA not foresee that the Premier League would grow so vast that it would eclipse the governing body itself in terms of global power and wealth? It seems like an incredible abdication of responsibility.
It is easy to judge with hindsight, but we have to look at the FA's calculus in 1991. It is highly unlikely they anticipated the sheer scale of the monster they were helping to create, because nobody truly understood the future value of live sports broadcasting rights.
Because it had never been done on this scale.
Right. At the time, the FA likely viewed the breakaway as a necessary restructuring to save the top tier of the game from financial ruin and infrastructure decay. They thought they were being pragmatic.
A rescue mission.
Furthermore, they believed they were retaining ultimate regulatory authority. They still controlled the rule book, the disciplinary procedures, and the FA Cup.
But they failed to understand that capital is the ultimate regulator. Money dictates power.
Yes, exactly. They severely underestimated the economic multiplier effect of pay TV. As the broadcasting rights swelled from that initial 191 million to multi-billion-pound deals, the balance of power decisively, irreversibly shifted to the Premier League clubs.
The FA became, in many ways, a bystander to the economic explosion of its own top division.
The clubs no longer needed the FA for revenue. They were entirely self-sustaining economic entities.
And what an economic explosion it was. As we move into the 2000s, the billions flooding into the league fundamentally altered the business model of running a football club. We enter an era defined by distinct periods of absolute dominance, fueled by unprecedented wealth, but also punctuated by statistical anomalies and miracles.
It's a fascinating era to study.
Let's look at how the capital actually affected the sporting product.
Yeah.
If we look at the 2003-04 season, we see the peak of what I would call the organic revenue model, the Invincibles.
Arsenal, under the management of Arsene Wenger. They achieved something that hadn't been done since Preston North End in the inaugural Football League season of 1888-1889.
Over a century prior.
Right. They went the entire 38-game Premier League campaign undefeated, 26 wins, 12 draws. They played a free-flowing, incredibly fluid, possession-based style of football. Thierry Henry scored 30 league goals that season. They eventually stretched that unbeaten run to 49 matches.
And they built that team largely through exceptional scouting, identifying undervalued talent in the European market, and generating organic revenue through a massive fan base and regular Champions League participation.
It was a very sustainable model.
In that very same season, just to highlight the concentration of talent the TV money was bringing in, a young 18-year-old Portuguese winger named Cristiano Ronaldo made his debut for Manchester United.
Oh, yes.
He takes David Beckham's number 7 shirt and immediately dazzles everyone with his footwork. The league was attracting the absolute elite global talent.
But the financial parameters were about to shift again, and this shift was far more disruptive than anything that had come before. It changed the fundamental mechanism of how a club achieves success.
The summer of 2004. Enter Roman Abramovich.
The Abramovich era. A Russian oligarch purchases Chelsea Football Club. This is not just a wealthy local businessman like Jack Walker at Blackburn. This is the introduction of sovereign-level billionaire wealth into the English game.
I want to break down exactly how this disrupted the market. Did Abramovich invent a new mechanism for building a football club? Or did he just scale up what Manchester United and Arsenal were already doing?
He completely broke the established mechanism.
Yeah.
Before Abramovich, a club's ability to buy players and pay wages was directly tied to their organic revenue. How many tickets they sold, how many shirts they sold, what their share of the TV money was.
So they could only spend what they earned.
Exactly. It was a somewhat meritocratic cycle. Win games, earn more money, buy better players. Abramovich severed that link entirely. He utilized his vast personal wealth to inject massive sums of capital into Chelsea through shareholder loans that he, as the owner, never intended to recall.
So it was effectively equity disguised as debt. It wasn't money the club had earned. It was just a blank check deposited into their account.
Well, to put it more precisely, it allowed Chelsea to operate with a wage bill and a transfer budget that was completely divorced from their actual business turnover.
They were playing by different rules.
They were. They could artificially inflate the transfer market, paying fees and offering wages that clubs operating on traditional business models simply could not match without taking on catastrophic levels of commercial debt. Arsene Wenger famously termed this financial doping.
And the sporting impact was immediate and ruthless. Abramovich brings in a young, incredibly confident manager fresh off a Champions League win with Porto, Jose Mourinho, the self-proclaimed special one.
And he delivered.
And in that 2004-05 season, they don't just win the title, they redefine defensive efficiency.
They won the league, ending a 50-year wait for Chelsea. But if you look at the statistical data from that season, the defensive records they set are still staggering to comprehend.
Hard to believe.
They conceded a total of 15 goals over a 38-game season. Goalkeeper Petr Cech kept 24 clean sheets and went 1,025 consecutive minutes without conceding a single goal, breaking Peter Schmeichel's record. They functioned like a perfectly calibrated, ruthlessly expensive machine.
And while this billionaire arms race is happening at the top, the archives show the immense, desperate drama occurring at the bottom of the table. In that exact same 2004-05 season, you have West Bromwich Albion achieving the Great Escape.
A completely different kind of drama.
They became the first team in Premier League history to avoid relegation after being dead last at the bottom of the table on Christmas Day. The stakes at both ends of the table were becoming incredibly high.
Because the financial reward for merely existing within the Premier League was becoming astronomical, we have to look at the broadcasting data. By 2004, the domestic live TV rights alone had jumped to over £1.024 billion for a 3-year cycle.
Over £1 billion.
This escalating revenue fundamentally altered the corporate philosophy of team building. English football became a highly attractive, high-yield asset class for global billionaires and sovereign wealth funds.
It created an aggressively expanding divide. You were either part of the elite cartel that could afford to buy the world's best talent and compete for titles, or you were a club desperately, frantically fighting just to avoid dropping out of this financial promised land.
The middle class of English football was essentially hollowed out.
Which is why the climax of the 2011-12 season is so fascinating from a narrative perspective. It is the ultimate expression of this new financial era. You have the Manchester rivalry peaking, Manchester City, now backed by the immense wealth of the Abu Dhabi United Group, functioning similarly to the Abramovich model, but on an even grander scale.
Right.
They beat Manchester United 6-1 at Old Trafford earlier in the season. That's the famous match where Mario Balotelli reveals the "Why always me?" shirt.
Yeah.
And it all culminates on the final day of the season. The two Manchester clubs are tied on points. City has a superior goal difference. They just need to beat Queen's Park Rangers at home to snatch the title from United. But as the 90 minutes expire, City are somehow losing 2-1.
The tension was unbelievable.
Manchester United have won their game and are waiting on the pitch at Sunderland, believing they have won the league. Then, Edin Dzeko equalizes for City in the 92nd minute. And then, with virtually the very last kick of the entire 38-game season, Sergio Aguero scores to win the game 3-2 and wins Manchester City their first league title in 44 years. It is pure, unscripted, heart-stopping drama.
It is arguably the most dramatic conclusion to a league season in the history of the sport. But from an economic standpoint, that specific moment, Aguero's goal, showcased exactly to the global broadcasters why the live rights were worth billions.
Because you can't fake that.
You simply cannot script that level of narrative tension in any other form of entertainment. It justified the massive outlay from Sky and the international networks. It proved the product was premium.
But if the Aguero moment proved the value of the product, the 2015-16 season broke every single economic model we've just discussed. We have to talk about the miracle. Leicester City.
Leicester City's triumph defies all logic, all financial modeling, and all historical precedent of the modern Premier League era.
It's absurd.
If you look at the betting markets before the season began, Leicester City were 5,001 underdogs to win the league. To put that in perspective, bookmakers considered it more likely that the Loch Ness Monster would be discovered than Leicester winning the title.
The context makes it even more absurd. The previous season, they had spent the vast majority of the year dead last in the league, requiring a miraculous run of form just to barely survive relegation.
Right, they barely stayed up.
They then appoint Claudio Ranieri as manager, a man who had recently been fired by the Greek national team after losing to the Faroe Islands. Most pundits thought he was entirely past his prime, a disastrous appointment. And yet, over 38 games, they systematically dismantle the wealthiest clubs in the country and win the league.
The personnel involved makes the statistical anomaly even more stark. You have Jamie Vardy, a striker who was literally playing non-league amateur football, earning £30 a week while working in a carbon fiber factory just a few years prior.
Incredible.
He goes on to break the Premier League record by scoring in 11 consecutive matches. You have Riyad Mahrez, bought for roughly £400,000 from the French Second Division, winning Player of the Year. You have N'Golo Kanté, a tireless midfielder who covered so much ground there was a joke that 70% of the earth is covered by water and the rest is covered by Kanté.
And they seal the title without even playing. They win it when Tottenham Hotspur, their closest rivals, blow a 2-0 lead in a chaotic, incredibly aggressive match to draw a 2-2 with Chelsea.
The Battle of Stamford Bridge.
Right. I look at this story, and I'm genuinely moved by it, but as an analyst, it just breaks my brain. It's like a local pub trivia team suddenly getting invited to Stockholm and winning the Nobel Prize in physics.
Yeah, it defies belief.
It simply shouldn't happen within the structural reality of the league. So I have to challenge the core premise of our financial discussion here. With money dictating so much of the success, like we saw with Abramovich's Chelsea and the Abu Dhabi investment in Manchester City, does Leicester's win prove that money isn't everything? Or is it just the ultimate exception that proves the rule?
If we look at the hard economic data provided in the season reviews, It is undeniably the exception that proves the rule. Leicester's triumph was a beautiful, historic, deeply romantic anomaly, but it was just that, an anomaly.
Okay, walk me through that.
Let's look at the mechanisms required for it to happen. It required an alignment of unprecedented factors, incredible, world-class scouting to find undervalued assets like Mahrez and Conte, perfect lightning-in-a-bottle team chemistry under Ranieri, a remarkable lack of serious injuries to their starting 11, and crucially, a systemic collapse of the elite cartel.
Right, the big clubs faltered.
Every single one of the traditional Big Six wealthy clubs heavily underperformed, transitioning managers or rebuilding squads in the exact same season.
So it wasn't a replicable business model.
Not at all. If you look at the champions in the decade before Leicester and the decade since Leicester, the correlation between a club's total wage bill and their final league position is overwhelmingly strong. In the long run, the team that spends the most money on wages almost always wins.
Money talks.
Leicester's wage bill that year was a fraction of Chelsea's or Manchester United's. They gave hope to every single fan in the world that miracles are possible over a 9-month period. But structurally, the data proves the league was still a deeply entrenched financial oligarchy.
Which brings us to the dark underbelly of this entire economic boom. We've spent a lot of time talking about the billions at the top, the Aguero moments, the miracles. But the documents we are analyzing, specifically the government's fan-led review of football governance, reveal that while the top of the Premier League provided this incredible, glossy, globally exported entertainment product, the bottom of the football pyramid was quietly beginning to collapse.
It was rotting from the inside.
The financial incentives driving the sport had become fundamentally toxic. Let's delve into this government review, because this is where the mafia thriller aspect really comes into play.
The fan-led review was not commissioned on a whim. It was triggered by a series of cascading crises that exposed the entire English football pyramid as a fragile house of cards. The government was forced to act because historic, beloved community institutions were quite literally being wiped off the map.
The review highlights the heartbreaking collapses of clubs like Bury FC and Macclesfield Town. These weren't just businesses. These were clubs that had existed for over a century. They were the focal points of their local communities, and they simply vanished.
Liquidated.
They were expelled from the league and liquidated due to catastrophic, entirely preventable financial mismanagement by their owners.
When you read the details within the review, it exposes a wildly unregulated ownership landscape. It is genuinely shocking what the football authorities permitted to happen. The existing fit and proper persons test for new owners was completely unfit for purpose.
Yeah, I was reading through the case studies in the review, and the negligence is astounding. You have accounts of owners with long documented histories of business bankruptcies and liquidations in other sectors being handed the keys to historic community assets.
That's reckless.
You have buyers acquiring football clubs without ever having to show actual proof of funds. They were essentially buying clubs with phantom money.
It gets much darker than that, actually. The review details instances of owners who utilized complex offshore hedge fund structures to acquire clubs, creating a labyrinth of shell companies where the governing bodies couldn't even identify who the actual human being in charge was.
Wow.
There were cases where buyers took control of a club, saddled the club with massive debt to pay themselves management fees, and subsequently went to prison for money laundering or fraud. In one particularly egregious case highlighted in the reports, a club was placed into financial administration by an owner who had purchased the club a mere 2 weeks earlier.
It's corporate rating applied to cultural institutions. But the review makes a very important point. The crisis wasn't just caused by bad actors or criminals. It was a systemic issue driven by the financial incentives of the league itself.
Yes.
And a massive portion of the review is dedicated to explaining the danger of something called parachute payments. I want us to spend some time breaking this down because it is crucial to understanding why clubs are going bankrupt. How do parachute payments actually work?
To understand parachute payments, you have to understand the massive financial cliff edge between the Premier League and the division immediately below it, the Championship. When a club is in the Premier League, they are earning over £100 million a year just from television rights. To compete at that level, they have to offer players massive multi-year contracts on Premier League wages.
Right. You can't survive in the top flight paying Championship wages.
Exactly. But if that club gets relegated down to the Championship, their television revenue drops by roughly 80% overnight. However, they are still legally obligated to pay those massive player contracts.
Which would bankrupt them.
If they had to absorb that revenue drop instantly, almost every relegated club would go into administration within months. So, to prevent this, the Premier League instituted parachute payments. They give the relegated clubs massive financial payouts, tens of millions of pounds, staggered over 2 or 3 years to cushion the fall and allow them time to offload expensive players and restructure their finances, hence a parachute.
Okay, on a micro level, for that specific club, it makes logical sense. It prevents immediate bankruptcy. But the fan-led review argues that on a macro level, it destroys the ecosystem. I look at this mechanism and it reminds me of a rigged local economy.
How so?
Imagine a town with a dozen independent coffee shops, all competing fairly. Suddenly, the local government decides to give 3 of those coffee shops a $50 million grant, while the others get nothing. Those 3 shops can now afford the best locations, the best equipment, and they can operate at a massive loss just to drive the others out of business. How can the other shops possibly survive without taking out predatory high-interest loans?
That analogy perfectly illustrates the market distortion. The unintended consequence of parachute payments is devastating for competitive balance in the championship. You suddenly have a league where 2 or 3 relegated clubs have tens of millions of pounds more in guaranteed revenue than the rest of the division.
It's an uneven playing field.
For the clubs without parachute payments, trying to compete for promotion to the Premier League becomes a desperate existential arms race.
Because promotion to the Premier League is essentially a £100 million winning lottery ticket.
It is the most lucrative single game in world football. So these non-parachute championship clubs look at the math and they realize they cannot compete organically. The only way to match the squads of the parachute clubs is to gamble heavily.
So they start overspending.
Recklessly. The financial data in the review shows that multiple championship clubs regularly spend more than 100% of their total annual revenue just on player wages.
Wait, I have to push back on the fundamental economics of this. If a club is spending 120% of the money it brings in solely on wages, before even paying for the stadium, the staff, or the travel, how are they keeping the lights on? Are the owners just underwriting massive monthly losses out of their own pockets?
Yes. They are entirely reliant on owner funding, which is often structured as debt piled onto the club. They are gambling their entire existence on winning that £100 million promotion lottery ticket.
That's terrifying.
If they achieve promotion, the gamble pays off, the debts are cleared by the TV money, and they are hailed as heroes. But if they fail to get promoted, and mathematically most of them have to fail, they face financial ruin.
And then the club folds.
The owner eventually runs out of money or patience, calls in the debt, and the club collapses, exactly like Bury and Macclesfield. The revenues at the very top of the English pyramid are astronomical, but the trickle-down effect is minimal compared to the massive inflationary pressure those revenues put on player wages in the lower leagues.
It's a terrifying system. The clubs are chasing an illusion of success, heavily incentivized to gamble by the sheer size of the prize at the top. But the ultimate expression of this corporate greed, the singular event that finally forced the UK government to step in and say, enough is enough, happened in April 2021, the European Super League.
The Super League was the logical, terrifying conclusion to the unrestrained capitalism we've been discussing. In April 2021, 6 of the wealthiest English clubs, Arsenal, Chelsea, Liverpool, Manchester City, Manchester United, and Tottenham Hotspur, secretly colluded with other European giants like Real Madrid and Juventus to form a breakaway competition.
But this wasn't just a new tournament. It was a structural revolution based on an American franchise model, right? Explain the economic theory behind what they were trying to build, because it completely subverts the history we talked about from 1888.
It was an attempt to replace an open meritocracy with a closed-loop cartel. The proposal was to form a closed, invite-only Super League. These founding clubs would be permanent, guaranteed members. They would be completely protected from relegation, regardless of how poorly they performed on the pitch.
No jeopardy.
Right. In the traditional European pyramid, if you have a terrible season, you get relegated, you lose your TV money, and your financial valuation plummets. It introduces immense financial risk for billionaire owners.
So the Super League was essentially an insurance policy for billionaires.
Exactly. It was a mechanism to eliminate sporting risk from their financial investments. By guaranteeing their participation every single year, they would guarantee their slice of the massive global broadcasting revenues. They would secure the valuation of their assets permanently, completely insulated from the consequences of losing football matches.
But in doing so, it was an absolute betrayal of the very foundation of the sport. It destroyed the fundamental social contract of football. The idea that you earn your success through sporting merit. The idea that a tiny club can rise from the bottom of the pyramid to the top, exactly like Leicester City did.
It would have ruined the domestic leagues.
The Super League threatened to devalue the domestic Premier League and destroy the English football pyramid entirely, because the massive TV money would follow the Super League clubs, leaving the rest of the domestic pyramid to starve.
And the reaction was visceral and immediate. It sparked an unprecedented outpouring of fury. Fans marched on stadiums. Players and managers openly rebelled against their own employers. Broadcasters condemned it. Even the Prime Minister threatened legislative action to stop it.
It was a massive backlash.
The sheer weight of the cultural backlash caused the project to collapse in just 48 hours. The English clubs panicked and withdrew, issuing groveling apologies.
But the damage was done. The veil had been lifted.
It demonstrated unequivocally to the public and the government that the billionaire owners viewed these historic clubs purely as financial assets to be optimized. They were completely detached from the local communities, the sporting heritage, and the cultural responsibility that comes with owning a football club.
Which is what the review addresses.
As the Secretary of State noted in the introduction to the fan-led review, the owners forgot that they are only temporary custodians of these clubs, and they forget the fans at their peril. This near-death experience for the sport proved that the free market could not regulate itself. It made the fan-led review not just a polite suggestion, but an absolute legislative necessity.
Which brings us to the proposed solutions, the blueprint for reclaiming the game. The government review suggests a radical overhaul of how the sport is managed, proposing the creation of something called IREF, the Independent Regulator for English Football.
IREF represents a seismic structural shift in British sports governance. For over 150 years, football has regulated itself through the FA and the various leagues. The fan-led review argues that self-regulation has completely failed. Therefore, an independent, statutory body must be created by an act of Parliament, and its primary tool for regulation would be a rigid, comprehensive licensing system.
How does that actually function in practice? Can a government regulator actually understand the complex, fast-moving football market?
Well, they don't need to pick the team on a Saturday. They need to audit the balance sheet on a Monday. Under IREF, every single professional club, from the glitz of the Premier League all the way down to the National League, would require a license to operate.
Okay, standard regulation.
To obtain and keep that license, they must prove ongoing financial sustainability. The regulator would have powers of advocacy, helping clubs implement better business practices, but crucially, it would have incredibly sharp teeth, extensive investigation and enforcement powers.
We are talking about severe penalties for financial mismanagement. The review outlines powers to issue massive fines, enforce points deductions, implement transfer bans, and in extreme cases, the regulator would have the power to step in, remove the owners, and appoint administrators to run the club to prevent it from going into liquidation.
Serious intervention.
But how do they stop the bad actors from getting in the door in the first place?
That is where the overhauled owners and directors test comes in. The old test, as we discussed, was essentially a cursory, self-certified background check. If you hadn't been convicted of fraud in a UK court, you were mostly fine to proceed. IREF proposes a completely new two-part test designed to actively weed out bad actors and incompetent businessmen.
What are the two parts?
The first part focuses on integrity and corporate governance history. Have you run businesses into the ground before? Are you linked to criminal enterprises? The second part is entirely financial. A prospective owner must present a viable, fully costed business plan for the club, and they must demonstrate with verifiable proof that they possess sufficient, legitimate financial resources to execute that plan over a multi-year period.
So no more phantom money.
And importantly, it's not just a one-time entry test. Owners will be reevaluated every 3 years, and anytime there is a significant change in corporate structure, ensuring ongoing compliance.
But the part of the fan-led review that I find most fascinating, the part that truly attempts to shift the power dynamics back to the people sitting in the stands, is the mandate for shadow boards. Explain the legal standing of a shadow board, because it sounds like something a billionaire owner could very easily just ignore.
The review recognizes that fans are a uniquely important stakeholder. You can change your supermarket, but you don't change your football club. A shadow board would be a legally mandated entity consisting of 5 to 12 democratically elected fans representing different demographics of the supporter base. Clubs would be legally obligated, as a condition of their IREF license, to hold at least quarterly meetings with this board. The club's CEO or executives must attend these meetings.
And just to clarify the boundaries here, this isn't about fans demanding the manager play a 4-4-2 formation on a Saturday.
No, it strictly concerns off-pitch governance. The fans are consulted on business strategies, marketing matters, stadium developments, and ticketing pricing. They are legally entitled to see redacted board papers and financial projections. It forces a level of transparency that simply does not exist currently.
Which is huge.
But you asked what stops a billionaire from ignoring them. The meetings themselves might not hold ultimate power, but the real teeth of the fan empowerment comes from a specific legal mechanism proposed alongside the shadow boards, the golden share.
I really want to dig into the corporate governance weeds on this because it sounds revolutionary. How can a government legally force a private company owned by a billionaire or a sovereign wealth fund to hand over veto power to a group of fans? What is the legal precedent for a golden share?
The precedent actually comes from the privatization of national industries in the UK during the 1980s. When the government sold off state-owned assets like British Aerospace or Rolls-Royce to private investors, they retained a golden share, a special class of stock that gave the government veto power over certain critical decisions, like a foreign takeover, to protect national security. The fan-led review proposes applying this exact corporate law mechanism to football clubs, utilizing the fan trust to protect cultural security.
So an article of association change is mandated by the regulator, giving a democratic fan trust this specific share. What exact items of club heritage does the golden share protect?
It gives the fans an absolute veto over irreversible changes to the club's identity. If a new owner wants to sell the historic stadium to property developers, or relocate the club to a different city to chase a better demographic market, or drastically change the historic club badge, or alter the traditional home shirt colors that the team has worn for a century, they cannot do it without the explicit democratic consent of the fans holding the golden share.
And most critically, in direct response to the events of April 2021, the golden share holds the veto over the club joining any new breakaway competition not officially affiliated with FIFA, UEFA, and the FA. It is a legally binding kill switch for any future European Super League attempts.
If we synthesize what this means in a broader economic context, the golden share acts as an emergency brake on pure, unrestrained capitalism within the sport. It forces global owners to legally acknowledge that football clubs are not just standard corporate assets. You cannot just rebrand them, move their factories, and squeeze them for maximum efficiency like a widget manufacturer.
They mean too much to people.
They are vital community assets, deeply embedded in the cultural, social, and historical fabric of their local areas. The golden share legally codifies that heritage.
There is one more crucial aspect of the fan-led review we must touch on before we finish. We've talked extensively about billions of pounds, sovereign wealth, and corporate governance. But the review dedicates serious time to the human cost of this massive industry. It focuses specifically on player welfare and the often overlooked reality of the academy system.
It is a profoundly sobering section of the report. The Premier League operates something called the Elite Player Performance Plan, or EPPP. This is an intensive, highly structured academy system designed to produce world-class footballing talent. Boys are brought into the system at incredibly young ages, often as young as 8 or 9 years old.
It's incredibly young.
From that moment, their entire lives, their educational pathways, and their social circles are largely dictated by the demands of the football club.
They're essentially professionalized before they even reach puberty. But the statistics detailed in the review regarding the success rate are brutal. Approximately 99% of young players who enter the elite academy system do not make it to a professional contract in the top leagues. We watch the television and celebrate the 1%, the global superstars, the Phil Fodens, the Bukayo Sakas, but the underlying system is basically a giant, ruthless funnel that processes and discards thousands of children every single year.
And the review highlights the devastating psychological impact when these young men are inevitably released, often around the age of 16 or 18. They face a massive crisis of identity loss and grief.
Because it's all they've ever known.
These boys have been told their entire lives that they are special, that they are future stars, that football is their sole purpose. And suddenly, with one brief meeting, they are handed a release paper and find themselves out on the street. They often have limited formal education, no alternative career backup plan, and their entire social identity has just been erased.
The research cited in the documents shows significant widespread mental health concerns among released academy players, with very few possessing the tools or resources to seek help for the depression, severe anxiety, or addiction issues that frequently follow being discarded by the sport.
It's a real tragedy.
So I have a very difficult practical question for you. We can implement financial regulations, we can mandate audits, we can even give fans a golden share to protect a stadium badge. But how can an independent regulator realistically force these massive corporate clubs to genuinely care for the mental health and long-term welfare of young players who have just been deemed financially useless to them?
It is arguably the most complex and difficult moral challenge the regulator will face, because you cannot easily legislate empathy into a corporate balance sheet.
Right, they're businesses.
However, the regulator can utilize the licensing system to mandate structural care. The review proposes that comprehensive aftercare programs become a strict condition of a club's operating license. Furthermore, the regulator can force the elite clubs to pay a portion of their massive broadcast revenues into a central, independent fund.
So making them pay for the cleanup, essentially.
This fund would be strictly dedicated to providing ongoing education, mental health support, and career transitioning services for players for years after they are released. It requires using financial leverage to force a shift in the industry's mindset, moving from viewing these young men purely as depreciating assets or lottery tickets to recognizing a fundamental, long-term duty of care for their holistic human development.
It is a heavy, necessary thought to sit with as we look at the entire scope of this industry. We've traced an incredible, turbulent journey over the last hour. We started with Ebenezer Morley arguing over the physical and moral philosophy of kicking shins in a smoky London tavern in 1863.
Seems like a lifetime ago.
We saw the sport fractured by the industrial realities of northern professionalism. We witnessed the birth of the FA Cup, the existential depression of the 1980s, and the explosive, billionaire-fueled breakaway of the Premier League in 1992. We've explored the artificial inflation of the Abramovich era, the beautiful statistical anomaly of Leicester City, the near collapse of the pyramid under the weight of parachute payments, and finally this massive government blueprint designed to hand the soul of the game back to the fans through a golden share.
It is a story of constant, friction-filled evolution. The history of English football is the history of attempting to balance deeply rooted cultural tradition with the insatiable demands of commercial growth. And the fan-led review is the ultimate realization that without intervention, the commercial growth will completely consume the tradition.
And as we bring this incredibly detailed deep dive to a gentle close, I want to leave you, the listener, with a lingering, provocative thought to mull over as you drift off into a peaceful sleep. We've spent a lot of time establishing that the golden share is a legal mechanism designed to protect heritage. It stops the owners from moving the stadium or changing the badge. But what happens when heritage and ambition directly collide?
That's the real test.
Imagine a scenario where fans successfully wield the golden share. But then, a multi-billion-dollar overseas investor approaches the club. They guarantee unprecedented on-pitch success. They promise to sign the best players in the world, and they offer to expand the club into a massive global brand.
Every fan's dream.
The only catch is they need to demolish the beloved historic local stadium and build a massive soulless corporate bowl on the outskirts of town to maximize corporate hospitality revenue. What happens when a local community's traditional values directly clash with a multi-billion-dollar opportunity?
It's the ultimate dilemma.
Does heritage ultimately have a price tag? When push comes to shove, and the promise of endless trophies is dangled in front of them, will fans choose to protect their history, or will they choose to win at all costs? It is a philosophical question the English game will have to reckon with as it constantly, inevitably moves forward. Even as we speak, the story continues to unfold, with the English men's senior team currently heading toward the 2026 World Cup qualifiers under the management of Thomas Tuchel. It is a constant reminder that the story of English football never truly stops. It just turns the page to a new, endlessly complicated chapter.
Beautifully put.
Thank you for joining us on this surprisingly dramatic journey through the archives today. We hope you found a moment of quiet reflection amidst the billions of pounds, the corporate maneuvers, and the broken dreams. We invite you to return tomorrow for a brand new, beautifully relaxing episode of Sleepcast. Remember, new episodes are released every single day to help you unwind. Until then, rest easy and good night.